Hey, this is Jennifer and Megan. We are two sisters from South Carolina on a mission to discover more about our British grandmother's life in London by reading, researching, and sharing her love letters she wrote during World War II. If you're looking for an interesting, unique perspective on life, love, and London during World War II, then you have found the right place. We will take you through each letter and bring them to life as we have recently traveled to some of the exact places mentioned in these letters. Think of this as a historic love story come to life. So grab your favorite beverage and blanket and prepare to dive in with us. This is the All My Love, Lucy podcast.
Hey, and welcome back to the All My Love, Lucy podcast. Today is episode number 4, and it's audio only today and Jennifer only today. Megan is not able to be here. And as you'll probably hear, my voice is a little off today. I've been sick, so just bear with me on that. But as always, we want to start off by saying thank you for all of the love and support from everyone. We're truly grateful and we're having such a wonderful time with this podcast, and we hope you're enjoying it. And we want to always mention too that if you're a first time listener, we encourage you to go back and start with episode number 1 so that you can catch up with all the information we've discussed so far, because this podcast is more like a series. So it's hard to just jump in and start from anywhere except the beginning. Also, as a reminder, we always have a complete, uninterrupted reading of the letter at the end of the episode, so be sure to stick around for that. So let's get started with letter number 4. June 22nd, 1944. My darling sweetheart, I have been staying with Muriel this week, and every day I have gone back to 133 to see if there was a letter from you. And today, when I found one, I could only thank God for answering my prayer. So, as mentioned before, we've talked a little bit about Muriel. Muriel is Lucy's best friend. Now, we aren't sure where Muriel lived at this point, but when Lucy refers to 133 here, this is her flat in Hampstead where she lived, where she wrote the letters from, and where she and Jimmie spent a lot of their time together when he was in London. Now, I have dreamed about this place for as long as I can remember. I used to imagine what it would look like, and in my mind, I just pictured something different than when I actually found a picture of it on Google Maps. And then once I found that picture, I always just imagined sitting on the steps that go up into the flat. And so in September, Megan and I were able to make that dream a reality when we were able to visit London. And it's hard to describe, it's hard to put into words how we felt when we were there. When we got out of the taxi, we got out and just kind of stood there and didn't really know what to do. It was a little overwhelming because we had been dreaming about this and just anticipating this moment of being there where she lived for so long, that when we were actually there, we didn't really know what to do. And of course, we did not go and knock on the door or anything like that, but we did hang around out there out front long enough to where people probably thought we were up to no good. But we got plenty of pictures and we'll share those with you. But it was just one of those surreal moments and just one of those great highlights of our trip to London, visiting the places that Lucy talks about. She goes on to say, "Yes, darling, I guessed you must soon be on the way to France, and I was so anxious for your safety. Darling, I could not wish for a lovelier letter, and you are always in my thoughts and grow dearer and closer to me every day." And so we kind of guessed that Jimmie had gone to France when they departed. I don't know if he went straight to France from the train station, but he did have to go. As we know, we've known that he was part of the campaigns and battles in Normandy and all those areas. And so here, this confirms that, yes, he had been on his way to France. Now, what was going on in France? I'm sure most people are, if you are aware of anything about the D-Day and everything that went on, then you know what was going on in France right now. Nightmares. horrific, hellacious nightmares, all these battles that were taking place. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, that kind of gives you a visual of what that might have been like. I know it's a movie, a Hollywood movie, but that movie shook me. And I didn't realize this, but the movie actually has a real life backstory about a U.S. soldier named Fritz Nyland. And I'm probably not saying his name right, so forgive me for that. But there was something called the Sole Survivor Directive given by the U.S. War Department, and it was designed to make sure that a family didn't lose all of their sons at the same time in battle. This sole survivor policy was birthed in response to the deaths of several sets of brothers at Pearl Harbor. Specifically, there were 5 brothers who died at Pearl Harbor, so one family lost all their sons in that one event. And so they came up with this sole survivor directive, and that was the story about Fritz Nyland is what inspired the story about Private Ryan, Saving Private Ryan. So that movie had some true backstory to it. So that was actually something that was going on at the time of this letter, around the time of this letter. Also, the Battle of Cherbourg, and I think I've said that correctly. I looked it up and tried to pronounce it. The Battle of Cherbourg. And this was the capture of a major deep water port. And that was going on at exactly the time of this letter. But this battle and the victory of capturing this major port was extremely important early on in Operation Overlord, because it allowed for direct access for reinforcements from the U.S., among other obvious important uses of a deep water port. Vital equipment and all that could be accessed much faster than if they had to unload and then reship from Britain. So that's another thing that was going on at the time of this letter when she's writing. And I don't think we've really talked much about our grandpa Jimmie and what his actual duties were, but we will go into greater detail about that next time. Briefly, he was a mortar gunner. So if you know anything about that, that's what he did. And it's a lot to talk about. So we want to give ample time to describing that and talking about that and things that he did in a later episode, maybe next time. I just want to make sure we have enough time. I don't have to be really fast about that. And so she goes on to say, my sister sent me 16 pounds to buy a Swiss traveling clock that she would like to get me as a wedding present for us both. So, darling, I'm getting it on Saturday and will bring it with me when I next meet you, which I hope will be much sooner than we expect. Darling, I get such a big thrill every time I think of that day, because when that happens, we shall not have to part again and will be together always. Now, as of right now, we cannot locate any of Jimmie's letters during this specific time period. So we really don't know what he's telling her exactly about how long they might be apart. But we get a sense of her thinking here that it won't be too awful long before they're together, based on what she said here about anticipating that it will be much sooner than they expect, and that she's going to be meeting him. So it kind of makes me think that she doesn't think it's going to be a really long time before they're together again. And then we have a couple more boxes that we've not gone through that could possibly have some of the letters during this time period in them. Now, we do have letters eventually, and we'll get to those. It's going to be more along the lines of October of this year, of 1944, before we start bringing in his letters. But during this first part of it, we can't find them, and if we do find them, of course, we'll go back and read them and bring them in. But right now, we don't. So she goes on to say, did you receive my letter with the red rose? I hope it pleased you and made you feel happy. Darling, I shall be glad to get home next week when I shall have more time to write to you. And so I started thinking about her being away from her flat and being with Muriel. And it made me wonder if Muriel maybe lived outside of London or a little bit out of like the main part. because of this. The summer of 1944 became known as the Summer of the Doodlebug in London. And you're going to hear Lucy talk more about these doodlebugs in future letters, but they were bombs. They were flying bombs with wings. And they were the forerunners to today's self guided missiles because they were like small airplanes without pilots. And so they were most definitely weapons of terror because they had a buzzing sound they made while they were in the air. They sounded like old motorbikes, but when the buzzing sound stopped, that meant they were out of fuel and they were going to quickly drop to the ground, and you had about 12 seconds to take cover. So I can only imagine that when that silence happened, when that buzzing stopped, that silence would have been terrorizing and they would have just been rushing and running to take cover, and it would have been constant. And the Germans were unleashing this horrific campaign or whatever they called it against London, that was undoubtedly a last-ditch effort to bring destruction to London as they rained down over 9,500 of these what they call V bombs, V as in vengeance. That's what it stood for, vengeance. They were aimed at southeast London, and that would have certainly ensured mass destruction and casualties in those areas. But specifically on this day, on Thursday, June 22nd, 1944, when Lucy was writing this letter, at 8:50 a.m. on that day, just 8.9 miles away from Lucy's flat, where she had visited that day at some point, but just 8.9 miles away from where she lived, a V-1 missile, or what they called Doodlebugs, hit a corset factory, killing 24 people, mostly teenage girls. And these workers were in the factory making parachutes for the war efforts. But sadly, tragically, most of the people killed in the back were in a bomb shelter near the garden. And when the bomb hit the factory fell over onto the shelter, which trapped them inside of their shelter. Horrific. And initially, the buried survivors could be heard singing, so they knew that they were still alive for a period of time. But by the time they were able to dig them out, and, you can imagine a factory falling over on top of something, that would take a long time to dig out. Tragically, they had all died. And you can read more about this at londonremembers.com. And that's where I got the information about this horrible tragedy. But if you want to read more about that, then londonremembers.com is where I got the information. But all of that said, it makes me wonder if Lucy and Muriel were staying somewhere a little bit outside of London to maybe escape some of this terror and madness of these doodlebugs. And she does mention it. She does mention them several more times in the letters, because this campaign, or whatever they called it, went on for from the summer, from June of 1944 all the way through the following, I think, March or the spring of the next year of 1945. So it was a long period of time to be constantly, I can't imagine, to be constantly hearing that noise and wondering, is it about to fall on top of your house? And right after, we'll talk more about this later too, but after the V-1 missile, then came the V-2 missile. And I think that one, she talks about this one too, but this one wasn't as terrorizing because it was silent. So you couldn't hear the buzzing, and then it ran out of gas. And then, so it would just, if it was coming, it would just fall on you. So you wouldn't be constantly terrorized, which is equally awful. But I guess the amount of fear that these doodlebugs invoked on people was an enormous amount of fear. So she goes on to say, "It is getting late now, so I must close. And darling, I never close my eyes until I've said a prayer for you. So try to be happy and take great care of yourself for my sake, sweetheart. And you know, too, I shall always love you just as you do me." Please write me a line whenever you get a chance. With all my love from your Lucy. So, we continue on this journey with Lucy as she details her life and hardships and longing while she still anxiously waits for the war to be over so that she and Jimmie can finally be reunited. Little does Lucy know what the next 9 months or so will bring to London. So don't miss any of our upcoming episodes as we discover more about life in London during this time and more about Lucy and Jimmie's beautiful love story. And as always, if you don't want to miss any of our episodes, please make sure to subscribe to our channels, hit that like button, leave us some comments, reviews, and please share with your friends. And again, we want to thank you so much for joining us and listening to the podcast. And we really hope you've enjoyed this episode. And as promised in the beginning, we will end here with an uninterrupted reading of this letter. So until next time, enjoy. June 22nd, 1944. My darling sweetheart, I have been staying with Muriel this week, and every day I have gone back to 133 to see if there was a letter from you. And today when I found one, I could only thank God for answering my prayer. Yes, darling, I guessed you must soon be on the way to France, and I was so anxious for your safety. Darling, I could not wish for a lovelier letter, and you are always in my thoughts and grow dearer and closer to me every day. My sister sent me 16 pounds to buy a Swiss traveling clock that she would like me to get as a wedding present for us both. So, darling, I am getting it on Saturday and will bring it with me when I next meet you, which I hope will be much sooner than we expect. Darling, I get such a big thrill every time I think of that day because when that happens, we shall not have to part again and will be together always. Did you receive my letter with a red rose? I hope it pleased you and made you feel happy. Darling, I shall be glad to get home next week when I shall have more time to write to you. It is getting late now, so I must close. But darling, I never close my eyes until I have said a prayer for you. So try to be happy and take great care of yourself for my sake. And sweetheart, you know too, I shall always love you, just as you do me. Please write me a line whenever you get a chance. With all my love, from your Lucy.
If you are hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode, and for that, we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We truly hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope you'll return for the next episode of the All My Love Lucy podcast.